Hello, welcome to the Historiator channel. Leave a like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Let's go! The man known in history as the pirate Captain Blackbeard is a historical enigma. There is considerable debate about where he was born and raised. Accounts from the early 18th century suggest that his name was Edward Thatch, or some similar variant. However, even this information is unreliable, as many who engaged in piracy during early modern times adopted pseudonyms for legal reasons and to prevent their more respectable relatives from being socially stigmatized. Traditional narratives claim that Blackbeard was born in the city of Bristol, in southwestern England, around 1680. There is general agreement about the period of his birth, due to descriptions of him being about 35 years old in the mid-1710s. Supporters of the idea that he was born in Bristol point to primary source documents of the time, which refer to the notorious pirate captain as, quote, a Bristol man born. Furthermore, in the 17th century, cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Newcastle had yet to emerge as industrial centers and were little more than provincial towns. Liverpool, in turn, had not yet begun its rapid ascent as the epicenter of the Atlantic triangular slave trade in England. At that time, economic power resided in Bristol, which, around the time of Blackbeard's birth, was home to much of England's Atlantic trade. Bristol was the second largest city and port in England, with many of its residents employed as sailors, possibly including the infamous Edward Teach. Other places have also been suggested as Blackbeard's place of origin, including Jamaica. This theory is based on evidence from a contemporary document that refers to Blackbeard as, quote, born in Jamaica, of very creditable parents. A third theory, presented in a recent book, argues that Teach was, in fact, a man named Edward Beard, originally from Bath County, North Carolina. As one reviewer of this book noted, in the absence of concrete evidence to determine the actual facts about the notorious pirate captain's early life, the theory of his origins in North Carolina is as plausible as any other. Although little is known about Blackbeard's youth, it is much easier to reconstruct the political and social context in which he lived. Whether he was born in Bristol, Jamaica, or North Carolina, he grew up within England's expanding colonial empire. England was a latecomer to successfully implementing colonization schemes in the New World, only beginning its rise in the early 17th century with the establishment of colonies in Virginia and Massachusetts. Although other empires, such as Spain and Portugal, had begun conquering the Americas earlier, the English tenaciously pursued the establishment of colonies to expand their influence. By the 1630s, English colonies had been established on several small islands in the Caribbean and West Indies, such as Nevis, St. Kitts, Bermuda, and Barbados. In the mid-1650s, Jamaica was seized from Spain in a military expedition that Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of the English Commonwealth, referred to as the Western Design. Later, in the mid-1660s, during the war with the Dutch Republic, the Dutch colony of New Holland was captured and renamed New York by the English. Through treaties and warfare, English colonies also claimed lands from Native American tribes along the North American seaboard. Trade flourished between these new colonies and the homeland, fueled by cash crops such as sugar and tobacco. This was the world of the English Atlantic in which Blackbeard and many other pirates rose to prominence in the early 18th century. At this point, it is worth briefly stepping back to examine the nature of piracy in the early modern world. The term piracy is, in a sense, a historical misnomer. In early modern times, this word was not used to refer to naval bandits. Instead, there were two types of individuals we would now call pirates. The first group, from which the modern word pirate is derived, were privateers. These were ship captains employed unofficially by the governments of European states to attack the vessels of rival nations. They were granted letters of marque or formal permissions from rulers, but if questioned, they claimed to be acting in a private capacity. Hence the name privateers. This arrangement benefited both monarchs and privateers. Monarchs, such as Queen Elizabeth I of England, could employ privateers like Sir Francis Drake to attack Spanish ships in the Caribbean during the 1570s and 1580s, even while England was officially at peace with Spain. This allowed the English government to avoid direct involvement in attacking the ships of another nation. For privateers, The occupation offered government protection and, in some cases, national fame, unlike later pirates who were perpetually hunted by the authorities of every nation. The second group, the true pirates who operated entirely on their own initiative and hid in pirate havens, are more accurately referred to as buccaneers. These buccaneers operated primarily in the northern and eastern Atlantic during the first half of the 16th century, sailing from remote ports in southern Ireland, England's West Country, and even parts of North Africa along the Moroccan coast. However, by the second half of the 17th century, as European colonial settlements expanded in the Americas, these buccaneers began moving westward. They increasingly based themselves in pirate havens in the Caribbean, from where they could directly target the growing number of ships traveling between English, Spanish, and French colonies. The increase in naval traffic across the Caribbean led to a massive surge in piracy in the Caribbean and Atlantic regions by the time Edward Teach was born. However, one final catalyst was needed to spark the expansion of piracy in the early 18th century. In November 1700, King Charles II of Spain died without a clear heir. In his will, Charles designated Philip of Anjou, a grandson of King Louis XIV of France, as his successor. However, the Austrian House of Habsburg also had a strong claim to the Spanish throne. Meanwhile, the English and the Dutch were determined to prevent France from gaining control of the vast Spanish Empire. As a result, a pan-European conflict broke out, the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted for 13 years. Much of the conflict unfolded in the Atlantic world, with numerous naval battles along the eastern seaboard of North America and throughout the Caribbean. During this time, Queen Anne's government in England began outfitting additional ships to send across the Atlantic to fight against the Spanish and French. Simultaneously, letters of marque were issued, granting privateer captains the authority to attack Spanish and French vessels. This strategy was cost-effective, as it allowed individuals who owned their own ships to bear the financial burden of naval operations. Many of the individuals who would later become some of the most infamous pirates started their careers in English government service during the War of the Spanish Succession. Edward Teach appears to have been one of these figures. Although we know almost nothing about his upbringing and early adult life, fragments of evidence suggest that by the 1700s, he was active in the Caribbean, serving aboard ships engaged in attacks on Spanish vessels during the war. Whatever the specifics of Edward Teach's background, a few details are discernible by this point. For instance, it is known that he could read and possibly write as well. In pre-modern times, literacy did not always include both skills. Some individuals could read but were unable to write, signing documents with a simple mark instead. This suggests that Teach may have come from a relatively affluent family and had access to some formal education during his youth. By the late 1700s or early 1710s, Teach was actively sailing with privateers operating under the semi-employment of the English crown in the Caribbean. He, or someone using the surname Thatch, was based out of Jamaica. A near-contemporary account briefly references his activities during this period, stating that Teach distinguished himself for his uncommon boldness and personal courage. However, Teach was never given command of a privateer ship and instead served under the direction of others, which is not surprising given his relatively young age. By the early 1710s, he may have risen to the rank of a senior officer aboard one of these privateering ships, considering his rapid ascent in the years that followed. In 1713, disaster struck the small army of English privateers operating in the waters between Newfoundland and the Caribbean. After years of stalemate, the decision-makers at the courts of London, Paris, Madrid, and Vienna negotiated a peace settlement. The agreement stipulated that Spain and France would never be united under a single member of the House of Bourbon. However, a member of the French royal family was allowed to sit on the Spanish throne. As compensation for this agreement, Britain and Austria received Spanish lands and colonies in Italy, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and other regions. With the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, thousands of privateers found themselves out of work. Faced with limited options, they had to decide: return to land, seek positions as legitimate mariners aboard merchant ships, or embrace a life of lawlessness as buccaneers. Many chose the latter, and Edward Teach was among them. A 1724 account published in London details Teach's early exploits, noting that he traveled to Barbados, where he joined the crew of a buccaneer ship commanded by Stede Bonnet, famously known as the Gentleman Pirate. Under Bonnet's leadership, Teach served as a foremast man, a middling officer, while they began raiding ships along the coast of the English colonies in North America. The precise timeline of Blackbeard's early piracy career remains unclear. Teach worked with Bonnet for some time, but Bonnet's refined and genteel demeanor reportedly clashed with the crew's rougher sensibilities. Eventually, they ousted Bonnet from command and appointed Teach as their new captain. Despite this, some accounts suggest that Blackbeard and Bonnet maintained amicable relations, as Bonnet soon returned to piracy with a new crew. By 1717, Blackbeard, Bonnet, and another pirate captain, Benjamin Hornigold, were actively targeting ships across the western Atlantic and Caribbean. They were particularly busy in the waters off the Carolinas and what would later become Georgia, extending eastward toward the Bahamas. At the time, areas like New Providence were effectively pirate strongholds. This stretch of water from the Outer Banks eastward was completely lawless in the immediate aftermath of the war. It was here that Blackbeard and Bonnet made their names and amassed their fortunes, preying on Spanish, English, and French merchant ships traveling from Florida northward to major ports like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. By the autumn of 1717, Blackbeard was primarily sailing in alliance with Benjamin Hornigold. Together, they commanded 3 ships: an aging sloop that Teach had acquired during his time as a junior partner to Stede Bonnet, and Revenge, the ship Teach took over after Bonnet's crew ousted their original captain. Interestingly, the name Revenge was a popular choice for pirate vessels, perhaps reflecting a sense of grievance among former privateers who felt betrayed by the peace settlements of 1713 and 1714. For them, piracy may have symbolized an act of retaliation against governments that had failed to adequately compensate their wartime efforts. The 3rd ship in their fleet was Hornigold's vessel, Ranger, and soon after, a 4th ship of unknown name joined their ranks. By this time, Blackbeard, Hornigold, and junior commanders like David Arroyo and Israel Hands were operating a small flotilla of pirate ships along the eastern seaboard of North America. Records from October 1717 reveal that they captured and looted several ships, including Robert and Good Intent, which were based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Dublin, Ireland, respectively. The haul from these raids must have been substantial, as Hornigold decided to retire shortly afterward. Taking one of the smaller sloops and the Ranger, he left piracy behind. In an ironic twist, Hornigold soon turned pirate hunter, aligning himself with the authorities. He and Blackbeard would never cross paths again. Now left with just the smaller sloop and the Revenge, Blackbeard and his crew continued their exploits. Their next major acquisition came on November 28, 1717, when they encountered a French ship near the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean, a vessel destined to become the most famous of Blackbeard's career. The vessel Blackbeard and his crew encountered was a Guineaman, a term used for slave ships that typically transported human cargo from the Guinea coast of West Africa to the Americas. The ship was named La Concorde, although it had previously been an English vessel before being captured by the French during the previous war. Blackbeard and his crew fired several broadside cannon shots, forcing the French ship to quickly surrender. At over 31 meters in length, with 40 cannons and the capacity to hold a crew of 200 or more pirates, La Concorde was larger than any ship Blackbeard had commanded before. He made it his flagship and renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that harkened back to Queen Anne, who had died in 1714, around the time the war ended and former privateers like Blackbeard turned to piracy. This renaming may have reflected a longing for the days when they felt favored by the English government. The fate of the slaves aboard La Concorde remains unclear. Some may have been abandoned with the French crew, while others could have been recruited by Blackbeard as new members of his pirate crew. With his new flagship and 2 additional vessels, Blackbeard continued raiding in the Caribbean and along the English colonies' shores through the winter of 1717 and into the spring of 1718. One of his most notorious prizes was the Great Allen, a large merchant ship captured near St. Vincent just days after the acquisition of Queen Anne's Revenge. The ship was looted, its crew marooned on shore, and the vessel was set ablaze. News of the attack spread as far as New England, where the Boston Newsletter reported that Blackbeard commanded 3 ships and at least 150 pirates, though other accounts suggest his crew numbered well over 300 by this time. This attack was the first of several valuable prizes Blackbeard and his crew would capture that winter in the Caribbean. The captain of one of the captured ships, Henry Bostock, provided one of the most detailed and reliable accounts of Blackbeard after he was deposed by the governor of the island colony of St. Christopher shortly after his return. Bostock described Teach as very tall and thin, with an immense black beard. At that time, Bostock believed that Blackbeard and his crew intended to spend the winter on the island of Hispaniola, planning to intercept one of the Spanish treasure ships that still sailed annually from the Americas to Europe, carrying the dwindling supplies of silver and gold from the mines of Mexico and Bolivia. Throughout these activities, Blackbeard and his crew operated within what was known as the Alliance of Pirates, which had been in existence since the late 16th century. This loose coalition of pirate crews initially emerged as buccaneers sought to profit from Spanish shipping, targeting vessels crossing from Spain's vast empire in the Americas to Europe. The alliance allowed pirates to collaborate and establish safe havens in various ports across the Atlantic. By the early 18th century, some of these pirate havens were located in places like Bermuda and Jamaica. Others were situated much farther afield, including parts of Western Africa. For a time, Madagascar, off the southeast coast of Africa, had become a significant pirate stronghold, where ships traveling from India and the East Indies to Europe could be intercepted. These pirate crews sought to steal anything they could find, though it was rare for them to come across chests full of gold or jewels, contrary to popular Hollywood depictions of piracy. More commonly, pirates looted large consignments of valuable products such as sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, cocoa, dyes, and spices, all of which could be sold for a good profit in the right markets. One thing was also certain: these pirates almost certainly never buried their loot. Pirates sold their loot for money, and then they spent it. If a pirate in the early 18th century was wandering around the Caribbean with a map marked with an X, he would have been a real oddity. Blackbeard quickly established his reputation within the Alliance of Pirates. While much of the legend surrounding him was later embellished by tall tales, there is little doubt that he impressed his contemporaries with his audacity and his physically imposing presence. His beard was, unsurprisingly, black and grown in such a way that it covered much of his face. It was famously described as a large quantity of hair, which, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there in a long time. His beard was so long that he would twist parts of it into ribbons, looping them around his ears in pigtails. In battle, he was said to walk the deck of his ship with a bandolier of 3 pistols slung over his shoulder, wearing a fur cap. According to legend, Blackbeard would also place lit matches or dynamite in his beard or cap, creating an image so terrifying that, as one account put it, imagination cannot form an idea of a fury from hell more frightful. His private life was steeped in fiction and legend. A prominent account of Teach's life, published in 1724, claimed that he was a polygamist, having been married at least 14 times, with a dozen of his wives still alive at the time. The same author noted that it was common practice for the pirate captain and his wives to. The extent to which this can be taken seriously, or whether it was entirely fabricated to shock a naive audience in early Georgian England, remains a matter of considerable debate. However, it is important to highlight that many historians specializing in the golden age of piracy believe that the author of this account, a writer using the pen name Charles Johnson, may have been a pirate himself, possibly active in the Caribbean in the late 1710s. Teach, also known as Blackbeard, was notorious for his heavy drinking. On one occasion, after a night of indulgence, he allegedly ordered his crew to set fire to the entire lower deck of his ship and then wandered about, shouting that he had created his own version of hell. A journal attributed to him, which unfortunately has not survived but was reportedly found aboard his ship after his death, contained entries such as, "Such a day. Rum all out," and elsewhere, "Such a day took one with a great deal of liquor on board, so kept the crew animated, very animated. Then everything was fine again." From entries like these, it's easy to understand how Blackbeard and other pirates of the time earned a reputation for their reckless and hedonistic lifestyles. While these sensational and often exaggerated details about his appearance and private life are fascinating, Blackbeard's reputation and legacy were primarily built on his actions during the winter of 1717 and into the spring and summer of 1718. After spending the winter in the Caribbean, he and his crew seemingly abandoned plans to attack the Spanish treasure fleet and instead sailed toward the Carolinas in North America. It was during this time that Thatch decided to blockade the port of Charleston, which was located in what is now South Carolina. At the time, Charleston was one of the most important ports in the British colonies of North America. By the early 18th century, it had become the epicenter of the tobacco trade in the southern colonies, with large shipments of tobacco being sent annually to the European market. Few would have dared to attack such a significant port, as it would attract too much attention, and it was believed that the port's defenses would be strong enough to repel any pirate attack. But Thatch was about to prove them wrong. That May, his ships appeared on the outskirts of Charleston, and the blockade of the port lasted for a period of 9 or 10 days. The port of Charleston lies inside the Charlestown Bar, a stretch of shoals forming a shallow barrier at the mouth of the Ashley River. Ships must navigate this bar carefully to avoid running aground. Aware of this, Blackbeard and his crew anchored their ships along the bar, waiting for their prey to attempt entering or leaving Charleston. During this time, they captured several ships, including the Crowley, an English vessel bound for London. On board were several prominent officials, whom Blackbeard took captive. He sent word to the governor of South Carolina, Robert Johnson, informing him of the capture and demanding a ransom, primarily in the form of medicines. This act suggests that there may have been an outbreak of disease among Thatch's crew or, perhaps, a growing penchant for opium smoking among the pirates. In any case, an arrangement was made, and Blackbeard released his captives after depriving them of their valuables and receiving the ransom. Afterward, Blackbeard decided it was best to make himself scarce before a flotilla of Royal Navy ships could be assembled to strike against him. The blockade of Charleston became one of the most striking events of the Golden Age of piracy, a period lasting over 2 weeks in which a pirate crew managed to effectively block all passage in and out of one of the foremost port towns in North America. While the blockade may have appeared to be a bold statement about the power of the pirate alliance in the years following the War of the Spanish Succession, events were quickly aligning to bring about a major crackdown on the actions of Blackbeard and his many allies. As early as 1715, the government of the new British monarch, King George I, who had arrived from Germany just weeks earlier to begin the rule of the House of Hanover following Queen Anne's death, initiated a program to suppress piracy. The new king and his ministers were deeply disturbed to learn that many of the mariners and privateers, who had so recently been allies of the crown against the French and Spanish, were now attacking any shipping they came across indiscriminately. On one hand, this threatened English economic interests in the region, while on the other, the fact that those attacking ships in the Caribbean and North Atlantic had once been aligned with the crown risked creating a diplomatic crisis for England, especially if they continued to target French or Spanish vessels. As a result, there was a strong determination to end the piratical activity from 1715 onwards. However, little progress was made in the first year or two. It wasn't until early 1717, when the HMS Scarborough, a ship of the Royal Navy, captured a pirate vessel off the island of St. Croix in the Caribbean, that the first victory was achieved. Still, there was a clear awareness that dozens of pirate ships were operating across the North Atlantic. Many proposed a strategy of conciliation, offering pirate captains and their followers pardons in exchange for ceasing their buccaneering activities. Recognizing that this would be a cheaper and quicker approach, the government of George I issued the Proclamation for the Suppression of Pirates, also known as the Act of Grace, in September 1717. The proclamation stipulated that any pirate who surrendered to a senior English magistrate or governor in one of the North American colonies or the Caribbean before September 5, 1718, would be pardoned for any crimes committed prior to January 5, 1718. The deadline was later extended to July 1, 1719. The catch was that anyone who did not surrender by that date would have a large bounty placed on their head and would be hunted by the Royal Navy. Blackbeard and many others like him now faced a difficult decision: accept the riches they had accumulated and retire, or continue their piratical ways and risk everything. Teach's movements in the months that followed, and indeed the course of the remainder of his life, were substantially influenced by two figures with very differing temperaments and attitudes toward piracy. One of these was Charles Eden, a British colonial officer who had been appointed as the governor of North Carolina in 1714, holding the post through the early 1720s. Eden was notoriously corrupt and was clearly in cahoots with Teach, as well as with others like Stede Bonnet and Benjamin Hornigold. An important source on Blackbeard's life, published in 1724, even suggests that Eden oversaw the nuptials for one of Teach's 14 marriages. Official complaints about Eden's conduct in the late 1710s indicated that he had benefited financially and materially from facilitating piratical activities off the coast of the Carolinas. Many former pirates, including Teach, turned to Eden to obtain pardons in 1718 and 1719. The counterpoint to Eden was Alexander Spotswood, a military commander who had been appointed as the governor of the Virginia colony just to the north of the Carolinas in 1710 during the war with France and Spain. Spotswood is generally credited with expanding the Virginia colony in the years that followed and beginning its westward expansion into the Blue Ridge Mountains, which would eventually become the state of West Virginia. Spotswood was a by-the-book government official, completely unlike his colleague in North Carolina. When the orders came in from 1715 onwards to crack down on the growing piracy threat, Spotswood was determined to carry out those orders. He took an uncompromising approach to Blackbeard and his allies in 1718, vowing to prosecute them with all the military and naval power at his disposal if they refused to accept the generous pardon offer extended by King George's government. Eden and Spotswood loomed over the pirates in the late 1710s, one offering a way out, the other promising their destruction if they did not surrender. For Blackbeard, the decision to seek a pardon was made easier by the events that occurred in the fortnight following the blockade of Charleston. After the quasi-naval siege of this major port town, Teach and his crew sailed north with the intention of careening their ships at Beaufort Inlet in what is now North Carolina, to scrape the hulls and prepare for a possible voyage to the Caribbean. However, for whatever reason, perhaps the prodigious amounts of alcohol the crew was said to consume, both the Queen Anne's Revenge and one of the smaller sloops were accidentally run aground on the sands of the inlet. The primary mast of Teach's flagship, along with extensive parts of the hull, was damaged in the process, and the crews lacked sufficient supplies to repair the ship. There is a theory that this might not have been as accidental as it first seemed, and that Blackbeard may have intentionally scuttled the ship to drastically reduce the size of his crew. The idea was that they would disperse on land in the Carolinas, leaving Blackbeard and his closest followers with a larger share of the booty they had acquired during the blockade of Charleston and their previous raids in the Caribbean. Whether accidental or intentional, by June 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge was left in the waters off North Carolina and was eventually claimed by the sea. The sinking of his flagship and the other sloop was significant, as it pushed Blackbeard to join the growing number of buccaneers seeking a pardon. He had first learned of the amnesty offer while in the Caribbean in the winter of 1717. It's possible that after learning of the amnesty, Blackbeard decided to seize one last large score by blockading Charleston, knowing he could take advantage of the pardon afterward. He then blockaded Charleston, scored a final loot, and ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground 2 weeks later to drive off most of his crew, ensuring that he could claim a larger portion of the loot. This theory aligns with the fact that, in midsummer 1718, just a week or two after the flagship was destroyed, he presented himself before Governor Eden and obtained a pardon from the Crown government for all his previous wrongdoings. This was a brilliant way for Blackbeard to extricate himself from the pirate life while acquiring significant riches over a few years of buccaneering. Even more fortuitous for him and other pirates were the growing tensions between England and Spain following Spain's reoccupation of the island of Sardinia in the Mediterranean. This was one of the territories Spain had ceded to Austria a few years earlier at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. If war broke out again between England and Spain, Teach, Bonnet, and others were doubtlessly calculating that they might be offered letters of marque to operate as privateers on behalf of the English government once more. However, if Blackbeard thought he could have the best of both worlds, he was soon disabused of that notion. Having obtained his pardon from Governor Eden in late June 1718, he and many other pirates began settling in coastal communities along the shores of the Carolinas. What he hadn't accounted for was the more scrupulous governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood. No sooner had Eden granted pardons to Blackbeard and other pirates who began settling along the Outer Banks and other parts of the Carolinas than Spotswood began preparing to prosecute these same individuals. This was possible because there was a flaw in Blackbeard's plan. The proclamation for the suppression of pirates, or the Act of Grace, which had promised pardons to buccaneers like Teach, contained a very specific provision. Anyone who availed themselves of the amnesty could do so until September 1718, a deadline later extended into 1719. However, the act also included a proviso that those seeking pardons would only be forgiven for crimes committed prior to January 5, 1718. This stipulation had been included for a specific reason: to prevent individuals from doing exactly what Blackbeard had done. He had learned of the pardon offer and then decided to engage in one last bout of piratical activity, knowing he could claim a pardon afterward. Teach had done precisely this when he blockaded Charleston, an action that took place 4 months after the January 5, 1718 deadline. Armed with this knowledge, Spotswood was determined to prosecute Blackbeard and his followers, regardless of the pardon Eden had issued to them in the summer of 1718. As Spotswood began plotting to undermine Blackbeard, Teach himself was settling near Bath Creek on Plum Point in North Carolina. He still had one small ship left after the wrecks in June and had petitioned to become a privateer, anticipating that England would soon be at war again with Spain. Many of his more loyal crewmen settled in the region with him. Eden was likely anxious that Blackbeard would obtain a letter of marque and leave North Carolina, as there was growing suspicion surrounding his own actions and role in issuing pardons to those involved in the blockade of Charleston the previous May. Issues were also quickly emerging in the coastal communities where the former pirates had settled, including lawlessness, drunkenness, and public disorder. In this environment, claims surfaced in August that Teach had been involved in a piracy attack on a French ship sailing along the coast. However, the Admiralty Court in Pennsylvania quickly convened and decided that the ship had been wrecked naturally. Despite this, the reports were enough for Spotswood to believe that he had sufficient grounds to override Eden's pardons and proceed with prosecuting the former pirates in the Carolinas. This approach was legally sound, given that the blockade of Charleston had occurred well after the January 1718 deadline for amnesty. Throughout August and September of 1718, Spotswood and his officials gathered enough information from individuals such as William Howard, the former quartermaster of the Queen Anne's Revenge, to know where Teach and his closest allies were residing in North Carolina. Armed with this intelligence, Spotswood began plotting a military campaign to the Outer Banks. He appointed Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a veteran of the War of the Spanish Succession, to oversee the mission, granting him command of 2 ships, the Ranger and the Jane, the latter being the renamed HMS Pearl. Maynard would be accompanied by just over 50 men, with a substantial financial reward offered for killing or capturing Blackbeard. This reward was provided by the Virginia colony, which feared that Teach and his associates would become a major problem for their trade and would soon begin attacking ships if left unchecked in North Carolina. Armed with dozens of cannons and incentives, Maynard and his men set out from Virginia on their 2 ships on the 17th of November 1718. An extensive contemporary account of the events that followed was published in London in 1724, providing an unusual level of detail about what would ultimately be the final moments of Blackbeard's life. After 4 days of cautiously making their way down the coast, Maynard and his crew aboard the Ranger and the Jane arrived at Ocracoke Inlet on the Outer Banks, near what is now known as Cape Lookout. They had proceeded carefully to avoid alerting Blackbeard or any of his followers to their arrival in North Carolina. However, it appears that Teach was informed of their coming, possibly by his old ally, Governor Eden. As a result, before Maynard and his ships even reached North Carolina, Teach had ordered his remaining crew to prepare his small sloop, the Adventure, either to engage Maynard or to attempt to slip away if the need arose. The pirates did not make a preemptive move to flee the Outer Banks, as this was not the first warning they had received about potential efforts by Spotswood and the Virginians to capture him. Had he not experienced these previous false alarms, Teach might have been more alert to the looming threat. Instead, Teach and several of his crew spent the night before Maynard's arrival at Ocracoke Inlet drinking in a local tavern. Maynard and his men anchored at the mouth of the inlet on the evening of the 21st of November, 1718. They spent the night there and only moved in the morning, after hoisting the king's colors to signal that they were on official crown business. By then, Teach and approximately 24 of his men were aboard the Adventure. Blackbeard severed the cables to release his ship and ordered his men to begin firing on Maynard's vessels. However, his escape plan was foiled when the Adventure ran aground. This allowed Maynard to close in, anchor, and command his larger crew, armed with more cannons, to open fire on the Adventure. A verbal exchange followed between Blackbeard and Maynard, with Teach reportedly raising a glass of spirits to his adversary, drinking it, and shouting that he would offer no quarter before once again ordering his men to fire. The subsequent exchange of gunfire resulted in casualties on both sides, with around a dozen men wounded or killed. Blackbeard nearly prevailed as Maynard's forces struggled to maneuver through the shallow waters. Teach then closed in on Maynard and engaged him directly, but Maynard's sword broke during the confrontation. The lieutenant would likely have been killed if not for the intervention of one of his men, who struck Blackbeard heavily in the neck and throat. Teach was shot shortly thereafter, and his remaining followers began to flee as Blackbeard collapsed, lifeless, to the ground. It was a fitting final stand. As one account described, here was the end of that courageous brute, who might have passed in the world for a hero had he been employed in a good cause. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head to be severed and brought aboard his ship. Maynard then sailed to Bath Town to seek medical treatment for his wounded men. Correspondence between Teach, Governor Eden, and others was allegedly found on the wreck of the Adventure and in Blackbeard's house, suggesting the governor's complicity with the pirates and links to individuals in New York. A diary belonging to Teach was also reportedly discovered, though, if it ever existed, it has unfortunately not survived. After recovering somewhat in Bath Town, Maynard and his men, along with several captured pirates, returned to Virginia to collect their bounty. Many of the prisoners were put on trial and later executed. Blackbeard's head was displayed on a spike at the entrance to the Chesapeake and James Rivers in Virginia as a warning to any pirates tempted to operate off the coast of the colony. News of the notorious pirate captain's death spread quickly, with newspapers in New York and Boston reporting on Blackbeard's demise by early December. His death on November 22, 1718, marked the beginning of a brutal government crackdown on piracy in the late 1710s. Just 2 weeks before Teach's death, his former accomplice, Stede Bonnet, was captured and brought to trial. He was sentenced to death and hanged in Charleston, the site of Blackbeard's greatest triumph, on December 10, 1718. A few months later, Benjamin Hornigold, who had turned pirate hunter, was lost at sea during a hurricane and was never seen again. In November 1720, another infamous buccaneer, Calico Jack Rackham, was captured in Jamaica. He was executed at Port Royal, and his body was hung on a gibbet as a warning to would-be pirates in the region. Two well-known female buccaneers, Mary Read and Bonnie, were captured with Calico Jack. Both were seemingly spared execution due to their pregnancies. Bonnie disappeared from the historical record after that, but Read died in prison. Finally, in February 1722, Bartholomew Roberts, a pirate often credited with creating the skull and crossbones flag, was killed in a clash with a Royal Navy ship off the coast of Gabon in Western Africa. Within a few years of Blackbeard's death, the vast majority of the more prominent pirate captains had joined him in Davy Jones's locker. Some relocated entirely to the Indian Ocean, where they were less likely to meet a violent end. Figures like Henry Every, a hugely successful pirate in the 1680s and 1690s, who retired in 1696 and likely lived a happy, obscure life into the 1710s, were the exception rather than the rule in piracy's so-called Golden Age. By the time Bartholomew Roberts was killed in the spring of 1722, the legend of the Buccaneers was already beginning to take shape. Their exploits had captured the imagination of the English public, and in 1724, a book appeared in London that began to establish Blackbeard as the archetype of the infamous pirate captain. The book, titled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, was allegedly written by a figure named Captain Charles Johnson. No record exists of any captain sailing under this name, and it is assumed that Johnson was using a pen name or pseudonym, leading to much speculation about the true identity of the author. One of the most intriguing theories suggests that the author was Daniel Defoe, who had published his famous work, Robinson Crusoe, 5 years earlier in 1719. Regardless of the author's true identity, A General History was highly influential in shaping modern ideas about the golden age of piracy and the reputations of figures like Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet. In the book, Teach and over 24 other famous pirate captains were profiled, and aspects of pirate life, such as the raising of the Jolly Roger flag, were noted. Blackbeard's reputation and legend only grew stronger as the years passed. The 19th century saw a renaissance in pirate lore, further solidifying the myth of the buccaneers. For instance, Blackbeard served as the basis for the central character in Matilda Douglas's fictional work Blackbeard, a page from the colonial history of Philadelphia, although the story had little to do with his actual actions off the coast of North Carolina. More significant, however, was the publication of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island in the early 1880s. This work, more than any other, established a wide array of tropes regarding the buccaneers of the golden age of piracy. Blackbeard is directly mentioned by Stevenson, and one character, Israel Hands, is named after the deputy commander of the Queen Anne's Revenge. A host of popular works in the 20th century have drawn inspiration from Blackbeard, notably J.M. Barrie's depiction of Captain Hook in Peter Pan. Hook, with his hook hand, is akin to Teach, who was often depicted running around the deck of his ship with dynamite in his beard. Numerous television shows and films have focused on characters named Blackbeard or based on the popular cultural image of the pirate captain, with the most recent version appearing in Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. Blackbeard's status as the most infamous of all the buccaneer captains of the golden age of piracy has ensured that academic interest in him remains strong, with universities securing funding for projects related to him, regardless of how loosely the connection might be. In the late 1990s, a project led to the discovery of the wreckage of the Queen Anne's Revenge off the coast of North Carolina. Naval archaeological expeditions at the site have since retrieved 30 cannons and tens of thousands of artifacts associated with the wreck. Live underwater footage of the wreck was even broadcast in the early 2000s. In 2011, the National Geographic Society confirmed that the wreckage was indeed Blackbeard's infamous ship. By that time, sufficient evidence had accumulated to verify its identity, including a wine glass commemorating the accession of King George I as the new monarch of Britain in 1714 and a sword marking the accession of Louis XV as King of France in 1715. Fragments of a book titled A Voyage to the South Sea, published in 1712, have even been identified among the wreckage, with all objects suggesting a wreck from the second half of the 1710s. When combined with the wreck's location and the nature of the ship, this makes it highly likely that the wreck is indeed the Queen Anne's Revenge. The story of the pirate Captain Blackbeard is quite unusual. He has become known as the quintessential pirate, a swashbuckling buccaneer who terrorized shipping across the Caribbean and along the seaboard of what would later become the United States. However, the circumstances of his birth remain unclear, including where and when he was born. The majority of his life remains an enigma. The historical record becomes more concrete only from the mid-1710s onwards, when he suddenly emerged onto the Atlantic scene in his mid-30s. His career as a pirate lasted only about 2 years before he was killed. Blackbeard's brief career as a pirate mirrors that of many other famous pirates of the Golden Age, most of whom were active in the years immediately following the War of the Spanish Succession. The majority of these pirates were either killed or captured by the late 1710s. In this sense, Blackbeard's story is representative of the pirates of his era. What do you think of Blackbeard? Is his reputation overrated, given that he was only a pirate captain for such a short time? Or does the terror he inspired make him a true legend? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. See you soon. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the world's stories and their mysteries.